retired from the United States Navy, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, former head of Southern Command. Now, of course, AdmiralStav.com, if you want to go to his website, a consultant with the Carlyle Group and a man about town, author of some extraordinary books, and sometimes a prognosticator about politics, not often. Before we turn to the Taliban deal, Admiral, you know Joe Biden well. Are you as surprised as I am by his Lazarus act last night?
Yeah, this is a political Houdini move if you look at it from the lens of 5 days ago. And I think a big factor, a pretty obvious comment here, but was Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar step up, and that is a big change. And I think the other surprise for a lot of political observers is Michael Bloomberg failing to really get traction. When those two things combined, I think is what buoyed Vice President Biden. And so, yeah, we got a real race.
We got a race, a two-person race that's going to go all the way to Milwaukee, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. But the Taliban deal with the United States is fresh, top of mind. Jennifer Griffin reporting 2 minutes ago for the Fox News Channel that the Taliban have carried out at least 76 attacks across 24 Afghan provinces since the withdrawal deal signed Saturday. The U.S. conducted its first airstrike against Taliban on Wednesday after an 11-day lull. What do you think of the deal as of today, Admiral Stav?
It's shaky, and I think all of us thought it would be very, very bumpy. I think I said at the height of the optimism, which was a couple of days ago, that there might be a 50% chance that the deal holds together. You got to knock that back a bit. I've also seen reports, Hugh, that the president has spoken with the lead Taliban negotiator. I think, obviously, the White House correctly wants to hold this deal together. It's going to be very challenging just because of facts on the ground. And having commanded that mission for 4 years during a period of time where we had 150,000 U.S. troops there, there is still a piece of good news to observe here, which is that we only, I put that in quotations, but we only have 13,000 troops there. So we've withdrawn 90% of our troops, and the Afghan security forces are doing a reasonably good job with our support financially, trainers, intelligence, logistics, of fighting the Taliban. So I think part of why the Taliban are continuing to attack the Afghan security forces, which is where they're confining those attacks, at least thus far. There have been no direct attacks against U.S. personnel or facilities. The Taliban are trying to create leverage going into these, hopefully, into these talks with the Afghan government. So going to be a very bumpy road. I think there's still a chance. I'm probably down somewhere to 1 in 3 about whether this deal can come together or not. But that's better than no deal, because I'll close with it. There's no military solution here. We're going to have to negotiate something.
Talk to us a little bit about you have a lot of experience with the Taliban. Do they have command and control over their various tribal affiliates? You think of the Haqqani network and all these different networks that we've been reading about for 20 years. Can they actually keep their bandits off their burrows for a few days, or are they always going to have freebooters out there operating on the fringes?
The latter, and certainly that's part of what you're seeing now. But I think as a broad comment, they control about 80% of their fighters in the field. That's still a lot of pirates cruising around the seas of Afghanistan. But that 80% is controllable, and they demonstrated it by reducing attacks from something around 80 a day down to 1, 2, 3 a day over that 7-day period. So they can control it. It is hard. The longer it goes, the harder it'll be for them. But again, that's a part of why I'd say it's only a 1 in 3 chance we can bring this thing off. And by the way, there's another tactical factor at work here, and that may be linked to these attacks. You may have seen that part of the deal the U.S. struck was to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. President of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, I can't blame him, is gagging on that one and saying, no, the U.S. can't simply release Afghan prisoners from Afghan jails. I do run a sovereign government here. So that's a sticking point, and that may be part of why the Taliban are reacting militarily to. So perhaps there's some negotiating trade space that our friend Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, with whom I've spoken, in the last week or so, can go back in, negotiate that. Maybe that will reduce the attacks and put the deal kind of back on track. That's the best we can hope for.
When you looked at those pictures coming out of Doha, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with the Taliban, there's one picture of him shaking hand with one Taliban leader, which is sort of historic. Did you recognize old faces from the briefing books, or has their leadership turned over since you turned over the reins of NATO?
Oh, I recognize many of those faces, and mostly they were on target lists with crosshairs across their foreheads. But we, the world moves on. We negotiate. We've done it in many other scenarios. The one who's a very tricky customer is their lead negotiator, Mullah Akhand, and he was front and center for all of this. But yes, this is a recognizable leadership team that we have tracked. We've killed many of them over the years. They have certainly gotten their licks in on us and on our allies. But in the end, so many of these insurgencies, probably 2/3 of them end with a negotiation. Read Max Boot's brilliant book, Invisible Armies, about how insurgencies end. They tend to end at a negotiating table.
Now, in terms of the persons that used to have crosshairs on them, what does victory look like to them? I always try and understand, what does the other side think victory looks like? Can they take a Kabul under the control of the existing? Do they just want Kandahar and the provinces of the south? Will they settle for that?
No, they want to return to Sharia law, and that's really the collision that is going to be very difficult to negotiate. In the end, I don't think the Taliban are going to simply be satisfied with a third of the seats in the Loya Jirga, their version of a parliament. I think that the Taliban want to see a nationwide Islamic state with a Sharia law attached to it. There may be a way to negotiate that, but here again, one of the real sticking points is going to be the rights of women, human rights, the universities, universal schooling. All of those are enormous gains that have been achieved over the 19 years, and I am very concerned that part of that may have to go away. So the Taliban, to directly answer the question, they want control of the government. They're willing to have, I think, a democratic-like entity, but they want control. They think they have popular backing. I don't think they do. I think that in anything remotely resembling a real democracy, the Taliban will not be able to control a government, at which time they will probably lean back toward recreating the insurgency. So it's not a bright future.
Are you still, I read your tweet when the deal was signed, endorsing the deal. Are you still thinking that it was worth the candle to try this, and are you still behind trying this?
I am. And despite all the difficulties I've outlined, we have two things going for us here. One is that the Taliban are fundamentally unpopular. This is not a popular insurgency. We have very, very good independent polling. Look at the Asia Society's annual poll, The People of Afghanistan. It's gold standard polling. Taliban are much lower in popularity than any other insurgency I've seen successfully come to the end. So the people of Afghanistan don't want what the Taliban are offering. And number two is there's still an international consensus, to include the United States, that we should stand behind the work we've done here. And that means, I hope, that we can continue to fund the Afghan security forces. That's the key. When we lost Vietnam, you and I are old enough to remember those helicopters lifting off the roof of the embassy in 1975. It wasn't because we lost the war on the battlefield. It was because the U.S. cut off funding at that point, combined with the fact that the North Vietnamese were somewhat more popular than the Taliban. So two factors that I think could hold the wheels on this thing. Take a look at my piece, just came out yesterday in Time Magazine on this subject for a longer exposition on it.
So to wrap it up, how do you grade Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on this one?
On this one, I'd give him a B+. I think, I don't know what else he could have done. And particularly, I'm going to give our negotiator, Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, former ambassador to Afghanistan, former ambassador to Iraq, Afghan American, speaks Pashto, Dari. We couldn't have invented him if he didn't exist, and I give him an A on his efforts.
So good idea to try. Imperfect execution up to the Taliban. When will we know? And even if they don't keep to it, this is the $64,000 question. Do you think we ought to get out?
I do not. I think our extremely minimal level of engagement at this point, 13,000 troops sounds like a lot. You know, we have 160,000 troops deployed all over the world, 13,000 in Afghanistan to support this effort, I think makes sense. And that's a conditions-based approach. And I think if we do stay, it keeps pressure on the Taliban. Eventually, they will come back. We can renegotiate. It'll be a long, frustrating process, but the idea of just walking away, I think, sends a terrible signal globally, and I think it condemns Afghanistan to a very dark future. I would not advocate simply walking away.
Admiral James Stavridis, always a pleasure to talk to Admiral Stav. His website, admiralstav.com, and, of course, he's with us once a week. Go and read any of his many terrific books, but I think probably Sea Power is the one you ought to begin with. Even here we're talking about landlocked Afghanistan, but Sea Power matters.